The first roundtable is going to tackle the topic of culture and art, and chair is going to be played by Associate Director of the WIAS and Professor for the Faculty of the Letters, Arts and Science of the Waseda University, Professor Yamamoto. The floor is yours, Yamamoto-san.
Hi, my name is Satomi Yamamoto. I'm Associate Director of WIAS. Thank you for gathering today here and online. Let me introduce the members of this table in brief. The first speaker is Professor Alison Shu, an assistant professor of WIAS. Her research field is international law, and she received her PhD from the University of Leeds. The second speaker is Professor Amane KASAI, an associate professor of WIAS. Her research field is history of music and artistic practices. She received her PhD from Tokyo University of the Arts, Tokyo Geidai. The third speaker is Professor Tomohiro Fujita, an associate professor of WIAS. His research field is mainly space physics, but from some curious reason, he also focusing on art fields in WIAS, like Leonardo da Vinci. He obtained his PhD at the University of Tokyo, Tokyo Daigaku. The fourth speaker is Professor Jacob Bloomfield, a visiting scholar of WIAS and a postdoctoral fellow of University of Konstanz. His research field is cultural history and history of sexuality and gender history. He obtained his PhD from the University of Konstanz. The last speaker of this table is Maho Osawa, a graduate student of Waseda University. She is now studying about medieval Japanese art history. One of the purposes of this symposium, we try to connect the fruitful 15 years achievement of WIAS to the next generation. So she and Eileen Morsa, who was one of the speakers of yesterday's session, are here. Okay, let us keep going to each paper. Professor Shu, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alison Shu. It's a great pleasure to be here and great honor to be presenting in this roundtable. So my background is in international law. So today I'm going to use my time slot to talk about this topic of protecting cultural property, especially during the ongoing armed conflicts from the perspective of international law. So I believe many of you are well aware of the ongoing situation about the Russia-Ukraine war, which started on February 24th, which is almost 10 months ago. So before I move on to talk about some detailed situation in Ukraine, I would like to first explain a few key concepts. So the first question we have is what do we mean by cultural property in international law? So historically speaking, the older generation of international treaties adopted a quite narrow definition of what it means by cultural properties. It mainly refers to historical monuments. Sometimes they included hospitals as cultural property. But most of the modern international treaties have adopted a more broadened scope to define what do we mean by cultural property, due to the nature of it being of great cultural importance. So here is an example I presented in the slides. That's a definition given by the 1954 Hague Convention on the Protection of Cultural Property in the Event of Armed Conflicts, which is one of the most authoritative legal instruments in this field. So it defines cultural properties as follows. So it says, well, it's movable or immovable property of great importance to the cultural heritage of every people. So from the first paragraph, it actually implies we only include tangible objects in this definition. So it can include historical monuments. It also includes historical sites, manuscripts, books, and given the definition, it can also cover digitalized items. So that's the first type of cultural property. And second type of cultural property refers to the so-called buildings and centers, whose purposes are to preserve the movable, immovable properties. So this type of items would include museums, archives, and libraries. So by definition, cultural property is pretty wide concept in international law. So now we know what cultural property is defined in international law. Then the real question is, how are those cultural properties treated during real armed conflicts? So there might be two legal questions raised in this context. First of all, so in the case of a long-lasting, severe military conflict, it's almost inevitable that the so-defined cultural property will suffer some damages due to the military confrontations. Then the question arises whether the destruction of those cultural properties can be considered criminalized, whether someone should be responsible for causing those damages. That's the first question. And second question is, during the ongoing armed conflicts, how can we protect the current the cultural damages, cultural property which are in danger due to the conflict situation? So here is an important international law principle called distinction. So during armed conflicts, both countries, those countries or states who are involved in an armed conflict, they should make a distinction between so-called military objects from civilian objects. So it's forbidden to attack civilian objects. And the cultural property, by definition, is definitely a civilian object. So states should have the responsibility to make such distinction during the combat. And that responsibility should be borne by, here in this case, if we're talking about Ukraine and Russia, should be assumed by both Ukraine and the Russia state. But what is the real situation? So here are two pictures. The one on your left-hand side is the Holy Mountain Lava, which is a monastery listed World Heritage in eastern Ukraine. It was very close to be bombed by Russian military attacks. So here is what it looks like, how much damage it has suffered. And the picture on your right-hand side is the picture of Freedom Square in Kharkiv city, which is the second largest city in Ukraine, after undertaking being bombed by Russian missiles. So a couple of governmental buildings were torn down. So those are the situation. And if we go back to the question, the legal question, the first one, definitely there are some destruction of cultural property. I'm sorry. Okay, if we turn to our first question, can the destruction of cultural property constitute the so-called war crime, which is also related to genocide? But there are two distinctive crimes in international law. So there is an argument there saying if a purposive killing of a group of people can constitute a war crime, then the destruction of cultural properties, which is of great importance to humanities, can also be criminalized in international criminal law. But the problem with this approach is this is not a state responsibility. It is an individual responsibility. The purpose or the aim of this crime is try to hold individuals accountable for the destruction of cultural property. And as you can imagine, holding individual responsible for a military operation of this type would be a lot more difficult to achieve in international law. So that's the first legal question. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the second question is what can we do actually to protect cultural property during those ongoing conflicts? So UNESCO has taken the leading role in this regard, together with the Hague Convention, which I mentioned before. So here is a list of what the attempts UNESCO has made after the breakout of the war. Next slide, please. Thank you. So first of all, they have a team of experts whose job was to identify the ongoing damages suffered among those across those cultural sites in Ukraine. And they keep updating their databases online. And so they have different verified damages, and they issued different calls for people to joint effort to protect, especially those cultural sites that are in danger. So the first role is identification. Next slide, please. Thank you. And the second one, so this blue shield emblem protection scheme was also established by the Hague Convention. So under this protection scheme, UNESCO, together with Ukraine governmental officials or experts appointed by the Ukraine government, will place those blue shield emblem outside the so-called identified or verified historical sites, making it clear that this is a historical site and all the combatants should observe the principle of distinction and avoid causing damages or attacking those sites. But this approach can also backfire. It has backfired in the history, where combatants purposefully target those historical sites that were marked with blue shield emblem. And of course, there's also a sense of a priority attached to the sites that have the blue shield emblem. So there's also a question whether it is fair to give priority treatment and who are responsible for verifying the priority or to verifying which sites deserve to have the blue shield emblem. Apart from that, there are also many other problems. For example, is it safe for staff to go out in the so-called battlefield and place those blue shield emblem, because there is a risk that staff who are responsible for taking care of the emblem will be attacked. Next slide, please. Thank you. And this one is called Saving Ukrainian Cultural Heritage Online. It was not something designed under international legal framework, but it was a voluntary NGO. If you're interested, please go to their website to have a look. So it was very impressive that a few scholars, after 3 days after the war broke out, they established this NGO online, basically inviting all the volunteers who can have access to save or to upload some materials or digitalize the materials about Ukrainian cultural heritage sites. So they currently have very large archives freely accessible online. And this one arguably has made great progress in terms of preserving the cultural heritage is currently in danger due to the war situation. Next slide, please. So this is a brief conclusion of my short presentation. Those two are open questions. The first one is how effective is the current legal framework in terms of providing an effective protection scheme for cultural heritage? To what extent can law actually work in practice? And the future question would be what can be done outside the legal framework? And I think the question can only be found not just by lawyers, but also by multidisciplinary study between lawyers and historians and scholars from other fields. So this has come to the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Shu. It's a very important issue to think about the cultural property, how and who take in charge of them. Thank you. So please go on to the next, Professor Kasai, please.
ご紹介に預かりました高等研究所講師の
Thank you for the introduction. I am KASAI of WIAS. The area of the specialty is the music and sound. So let me touch upon the issues. Do you know what this image is? I think that this is a familiar slide for the people conducting research on cosmology. And this is the spaceship Voyager's record. So who was the leader of the team, of the exploratory team, the Dr. Carl Sagan, came up to the idea to put a record on board. The pictures and the various spoken languages and the music around the world are recorded. So hopefully to the day and to be decoded, and the Voyager is still on the voyage. So these are the audible the sounds by the human beings. Whether this is audible by the extraterrestrial. So when it is possible to be decoded, then whether those the sounds could be heard is a separate issue. At this point in time, we have no idea what will be in the likely sound to be heard by the extraterrestrials. So how we can communicate with those beings? Let me consider that from different angles. The hearing of the extraterrestrials have been imagined a number of times. For example, in the legendary The Third Kind, there is a famous scene of having a contact with those beings. Excuse me. So that this is a spaceship. Here, there are the music melody that has been used as a means to communicate between the two the groups. The musical pitch is different by a group, but based on the Westerners and the musical pitch, that this has been used for the communications. And as for the different movie, Mars Attack, the translation, the software has been invented at an alarming speed, and this is the device being used.
We come in peace.
So the people in the mass, how they speak is different, and it sounds like a bird. But in any movies, the sound communication has been attempted. But beyond the comprehension, the audible the range, do we have the consistent and audible range? So now this is the hearing range. At the very bottom, the human beings from 20 to 20,000 hertz. So the lower the frequency is ultra low the frequency, and high frequency are so as we say, the cats and the dogs are good in hearing, so they can hear the higher frequency in the sounds, and the same goes with dolphins. But so the hearing area is different between bat and chicken. Bees, they recognize the sound by vibration. 265 to 350 hertz is the hearing range of bees, so the range is quite limited. So not only then the extraterrestrials, but even the living beings and on Earth, we've got a different hearing range. Then you may wonder what is the linkage between well-being and hearing. So the social well-being from the perspective of the others and hearing, and that's the perspective that came up to my mind. There are various approaches that could be possible. But in my understanding, the well-being is the social and the issue based on imagining and respecting others, contentment, rather than the pursuing one's own happiness. So there is an overlap of the previous the presentations. So how difficult to sustain the people's lives, and we have to imagine how the situation of the others is. So how we can imagine the hearing or unhearing. In daily lives, there are many mechanisms in having the same assumption of having the same ability to hear. For example, the acoustic alarming devices such as car horns and the fire alarms, those are based on sounds. So now there is less penetrating of the device being used for using light or vibration. But in your daily life, probably you feel often having a difficulty in hearing. For example, in the crowd, you hear many noises and unable to hear the sound that you want to hear clearly. So the difficulty of the hearing does not mean that you cannot hear. And of course, the aging may be another cause of having the difficulty in hearing. So mosquito tone is used in the city, but as the time goes by, when people are getting aged, then we are difficult to hear those high tone the sounds. So mosquito tone is not audible for all people. I think I'm good at hearing. But my highest range of hearing could be up to the 70,000 hertz. So depending on the condition and the environment, the audible area is different time to time. There are the number of the movies being released to stimulate the sense of hearing. And the first one is a sound metal. The main character, who is a drummer and having the sudden difficulty in hearing, so audiences could trace and simulate the experience that main character had. And La Famille Bélier, this is a French movie. There is one family, and within the single family, and having the people to be able to hear and not to be able to hear. So there is a struggle within the family, and this has been remade in Hollywood with the title of Coda. And this won the Oscar, so you may remember this. So the coda is the people and the people to be able to hear, and within the family, and having a parents not to be able to hear. So the different type of hearing and communication have been focused recently. And unable to hear, or the having difficulty in the hearing cannot be measured whether people can hear or not to be able to hear. So these are some of the examples of having a difficulty in hearing, and this is the extract. There are many the mimic the sound and represented how people hear the sound. So even in the same space, but how people hear is diverse by person. I conducted the research on the tourist sites, cinemas and festivals, and tried to identify how difficult to hear or the difference in hearing. Even within the same environment, the people may listen or may not be able to listen or half listen. So we shouldn't have the clear distinction of the hearing or not to be able to hear, but we should be mindful of the different degrees of the hearing. And the conducting and the practice and the research on the different level of the hearing will facilitate the well-being in society. That concludes my presentation. Not to be able to hear and hearing may be overlooked comparing to the visibility and not the visible. So now this is something we would like to discuss later. Thank you.
Okay, so it's my great pleasure to give a talk here. So I'm Tomohiro FUJITA from WIAS. So today let me talk about astrology and cosmology for surviving uncertain times. So I'm an astrophysicist, but let me talk first about astrology, and then let me briefly mention about cosmology, which is my expertise. So let's get started looking up sky. So this is tonight's starry sky. So 10 p.m. at Tokyo. So and let's take a closer look. We can see moons over here, Mars. Can you see my pointer? Yeah. And Jupiter here. And also there are a lot of winter constellations like Orion here, over there. So, but do you know who made these starry constellations? So it's made by Babylonian people. So it's Mesopotamia initiated constellations. So as early as 8th century BC, Babylonian people started something like a not really scientific but empirical approach to the universe, which is known as Chaldean's wisdom, and it propagated to the other countries, including ancient Greek, and mixed up with other cultures, Greek myths, for example, and eventually arrived at Japan in the 12th century. Here I show the oldest horoscope made in. I can see this. Oldest Japanese horoscope for boy born in December 25th, 1112. So we can see that even at that time, 1,000 years ago, people wished to know about the destiny of their child, looking at the sky and stars. So to explain how astrology works, our chair, Professor Satomi Yamamoto sensei, kindly allowed me to make her own horoscope. And I will use this example to explain how astrology works. But first, before taking a closer look at her horoscope, first let me talk a bit about astronomy. Oh, no, before that, I was very surprised when I made this horoscope. It's very special because you see these symbols represent some planets, but these planets came together at a very compact region. So I made, for comparison, I made another horoscope. Some baby just born 1 hour ago, today at Tokyo. So you can see these planets, these symbols are widely distributed over this horoscope. But in her case, Satomi's horoscope, many planets, main planets are got together at one region. So I will explain the implication of that later. But first, let's start with this basic thing. So solar system. So we got Sun, Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. And each these planets, including Moon, has its symbol in astrology. And these symbols are often used also in modern astronomy as well. And so now I need to explain zodiac. So as you know, the Earth is revolving around the sun, right? Here's the sun and the Earth. So we observe all the stars, including sun, from Earth. So from our point of view, apparently, sun moves on some part of the sky for 1 year. So that region of the sky is called the zodiac. So that zodiac is a belt-shaped region of the sky, and the sun, not only sun, but also moon and other planets of the solar system, apparently move in this region of the sky, zodiac region. So zodiac is divided into 12 signs, 12 parts. Each of the region has its own assigned constellation. So for example, here's Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, Leo. So when we say, in the daily conversation, we often say, "Oh, I'm a Gemini." That means when you're born, the sun is apparently located in the region of Gemini. But in the traditional astrology, we use not only the position of the sun, but also all the planets. So that gives you much more detailed information over your personality and destiny. And it's very important to know the position of the planets very precisely. For example, this is one example of the configuration of stars, planets, when you're born. So from the Earth, the sun is in the direction of Gemini, as you can see. But for example, Jupiter, apparently is in the region of Virgo. So we need to know all these information to use astrology. And it's not very easy, especially in the medieval time or ancient time. Here is an illustration that the women are about to give a birth of the child. At the same time, these gentlemen try to observe the stars and the moon. But please imagine that if your kid was born in the daytime, you cannot observe stars or planets. So in that case, you need to hire a good astronomer or astrologist who can accurately calculate their position of stars or planets and make a horoscope and read it. So it greatly contributed to the development of astronomy, like modern precise astronomy. So come back to Yamamoto-sensei's horoscope. Let's read it. So how to read it? So again, these symbols represent the planets, as I explained, and the other outer region correspond to the zodiac symbols. And how to read? So zodiac sign, zodiac symbol carries its own keywords. For example, Taurus, keywords is sensuous, peaceful, stable, and obstinate. And Gemini has a keyword that like communicative or perceptive. And also planets has its own meaning. So sun represents the nature of yourself, moon is inside of you, feelings, and Venus represents the values. So like combining these information, you can read that. For example, so it's actually easy. Satomi's case is easy. So moon and sun is in Taurus. So her both her main part and the inner part is stable and peaceful. And so Venus is in the Gemini, so she puts a value on the communication, for example. I think that's pretty much her personality as far as I know. And very good for good stars for to be a researcher. But I also point out one bit unusual perspective or remarkable part of this horoscope. You see that this red line, so there is a so-called opposition between Moon and Jupiter. So opposition means the Moon and Jupiter make almost 180 degrees. So it's at the other side of the horoscope. So the people who has this kind of opposition between Moon and Jupiter tend to have a careless or waste money or time, and not so good at keeping a relationship with others. So I don't say that's the main part of Yamamoto Sensei, but she might have such a small property. And we can say more about the horoscope by using, for example, here is some numbers. It's called house, and you can, by using that, you can say something about the destiny of her. But time is limited. I skip them. So anyway, so my point is, astrology can be used to find some hidden nature or destiny of you. So it's still useful, I believe, and it gives you a new perspective. And let me briefly go through cosmology part. Let me skip some slide because time is limited. But okay, so first slide is just what I wanted is universe is big, as we all know. So, but here's my favorite one. So the modern cosmology revealed that the age of the universe is 13.8 billion years. It's so long. So it's so long, it's difficult for us to understand that. So let's compress such a long time into just 1 year. So meaning the January 1st correspond to the beginning of the universe, and the December 31st, end of the year, correspond to the present time. So what happened in that case? So what if the age of the universe was just 1 year? So January 1st correspond to the birth of the universe, and the formation of a solar system correspond to the August. And the first life appeared on Earth was in the September. It's already more than half of the year. So Mamo was born on December 26th, so it's already after Christmas. The extinction of dinosaur was December 29th, and the human being finally appeared on Earth, December 31st, 9 p.m. And I was born in December 31st, 11 p.m., 59 minutes, 59.92 seconds. So literally end of the year. So typically human life is just 0.2 seconds if the age of the universe was just 1 year. So life is short. So I think there's the take-home message, don't worry, be happy. So let me summarize my talk. So astrology has been developed to meet the demand of people living in uncertain time. So it's still useful to obtain new perspective and get some intuition of your life. And second, so cosmology revealed our universe is big and old enough to make us feel very small. We are tiny. So I think messages, don't worry, be happy. Thank you very much.
Fujita Sensei, ありがとうございます。
Fujita Sensei, thank you very much. That was quite interesting. And I would have loved to know about my horoscope much earlier.
Keep on, Professor Bloomfield. Okay.
Thanks very much. Beautiful. Hi, I'm Jacob Bloomfield. I'm a Zukunft's colleague postdoctoral fellow at the University of Konstanz, and I'm also a visiting scholar at WIAS. And thank you very much for having me on this wonderful panel and in the symposium. My talk is called Joie de Vivre Amidst Repression and Danger, Case Studies from History of Male Cross-Dressing from the 18th to 20th Centuries. And I put an asterisk next to male there to acknowledge the ambiguity of that category. And just a note, in this presentation, I'll be referring to language that reflects bigoted historical views. So just hold on one second. Okay, so the overall theme of the symposium is well-being in the time of uncertainty. The theme for today is life, and the theme for this panel is culture and arts. So I thought I would have a topic that synthesizes all of that. So my main point is, even in times of uncertainty, phenomena such as joy, frivolity, art, creativity, and fun can exist alongside repression, pain, sorrow, and fear. So a famous instance of this in queer history is the Stonewall riots, which took place in New York City in 1969. The Stonewall Inn was a gay bar, still is a gay bar. It used to be run by the mafia, no longer run by the mafia, thankfully. The Stonewall riots were kind of a series of skirmishes between patrons of the bar and the police. that happened from the early hours of the 28th of June through the 3rd of July. And basically the police raided the Stonewall Inn, as they often did, and on the 28th of June, the patrons just got pissed off and started fighting back against the police, and people in the neighborhood also joined in. So recollections of this event describe joyful resistance. You have scenes of violence, for instance, objects being thrown at the police. One witness remembered a drag queen kicking a police officer in the face, but there were also scenes of joy and frivolity. So for instance, there was a chorus line and the rioters started singing, and one witness said, "We were very happy that night. We were joyous. At one point, I felt like screaming, 'I'm gay,' in the middle of the street. That was unheard of." And so there's this popular narrative that the Stonewall riots were when the LGBTQ community, particularly in the West, sort of came out of the closet, and the period before then was a long period of closet dwelling. But I'm going to talk about how there's a historical precedence for this kind of joyful resistance. So one case study involves the Mollies and Molly houses in 18th century Britain. So from the early 18th century, the Molly subculture was visible in London, and Mollies were cross-dressing, effeminate men who gathered in public houses, lodging houses, and other venues referred to as Molly houses. And witnesses to these Molly houses described a joyous, convivial, libertine, sensuous, and free-spirited atmosphere. They were actually having a lot more fun in the Molly houses centuries earlier than they were in the Stonewall. The Stonewall Inn was very dingy, the drinks were watered down, but at the Molly houses, people were having a great time. So for instance, one witness said, "I found between 40 and 50 men making love to one another, as they called it. Sometimes they would sit on each other's laps, kissing in a lewd manner, and using their hands indecently." I'll leave you to imagine what he means by that. "Then they would get up, dance, and make curtsies, and mimic the voices of women. Then they'd hug and play and toy, and go out by couples into another room on the same floor to be married, as they called it." Another witness describes dancing, singing, fiddling, not just euphemistic sexual fiddling, but actually playing of the fiddle. And the Mollies also participated in demonstrations of resistance. So sometimes, as in the case with the Stonewall Inn, police raided the Molly houses and charged people in the Molly houses with homosexual offenses and public disorder offenses. And there's one instance in 1727, one of the first conspicuous examples of, quote, gay resistance that we see in history, when Charles Hitchin was convicted of attempted sodomy. So he did actually do the sodomy, but they only got him for attempted sodomy. I guess he had a spreadsheet or something where they saw his plans. So when he was pilloried as punishment, Hitchens' quote, friends and brethren in the Molly community blocked the path and fought with an angry mob who wished to harm him. Let's move to 19th century New York City to look at the case of Peter Sawali, aka Mary Jones, aka Beefsteak Pete, and I'll talk about that nickname in a second. So Sawali was a black, gender non-conforming, probable sex worker, and keep in mind this was at a time before slavery was abolished entirely in the US. And so Sawali was arrested and sentenced to 5 years in prison in 1836 for stealing the wallets of men with whom she'd had sexual encounters. And there's the coverage of the case reveals that Sawali was a creative and inventive and resourceful person. So it was reported that to sustain his pretension and to impose upon men, she had been fitted with a piece of cow, pierced and opened like a woman's womb, held up by a girdle. So what that means is Sawali had invented an artificial vulva made of leather. That's why they called Sawali Beefsteak Pete. And this facilitated the sort of illusion when Sawali had their sexual encounters. So Sawali went to prison in 1836, but she just bounced right back. So in 1845, it was reported that, quote, a notorious character known as Beefsteak Pete was arrested on Thursday night, perambulating the street in women's attire. And then, so Wally went to jail again, but then in 1846, after only just being released that week from jail, it was reported that, quote, Pete Savanley, they got their name wrong, alias Beefsteak Pete, a notorious black rascal who dresses in female attire and parades about the street, was arrested again for playing up his old game, sailing along the street in the full rig of a female. So they got released from prison, and that week they were parading around, and so that's a symbol of defiance. Presumably they had their artificial vulva with them as well. And then for the last case study, I thought I'd talk about the police raid on the Holland Park Drag Ball, aka Lady Austin's Camp Boys Ball, in London, December 1932. So this was a ball attended by cross-dressed men and masculine presenting men, and they would dance and drink and have fun and also have sex with one another. So the police were made aware of this, and the police actually went undercover to infiltrate this ball, and the police actually participated in sex acts with the attendees of the ball as part of their undercover operation. So they were very professional, of course, and the police went back and made their fellow police officers aware of this, and so the ball was raided. But they weren't expecting that they were going to get some critique from the ball attendees during the raid. So during the raid, Austin S., who ran the balls, asked Inspector Francis if a passing man was a detective. He was, and Austin commented, quote, fancy that, he is too nice. I could love him and rub his Jimmy for hours. When Francis cautioned him, Austin replied, quote, there is nothing wrong in that. You may think so, but it is what we call real love, man for man. You call us Nancys and bumboys, but before long, our cult will be allowed in this country. And then other attendees echoed this sense of defiance. So Lady Austin fiercely putting up a fight and also kind of funnily threatening to give a police officer manual stimulation, I guess I'll say. So, in conclusion, even in times of uncertainty, phenomena such as joy, frivolity, art, creativity, and fun can exist alongside repression, pain, sorrow, and fear. And secondly, the history of sexuality shouldn't be read straightforwardly as a history of sexual repression, even within kind of repressive frameworks. Gender non-conforming and same-sex desiring people were capable of living happy lives, finding community, and so on. So that concludes my talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So many interesting topics. And then keep going to the Osawa-san. Osawa-san, よろしくお願いします。
The floor is yours, Osawa-san.
早稲田大学文学学術院の
My name is Osawa. Nice to meet you. I belong to the Graduate School of Letters, Arts and Sciences of the Waseda University. Let me briefly present methodology for research of art history as I touch upon the perspective of the eco-criticism which is recently receiving attention nowadays. Eco-criticism has been started back in the beginning of 1990s in the United States against the backdrop of increasing sense of crisis against global environmental issue. It is a thoroughly cultural research and criticism that focuses on the relationship between the nature and humans. Initially, in the US, the re-evaluation of nature writing, non-affections that puts focus on the relationship between man and nature, and activities to introduce ecocentric authors were conducted, though from year 2000 onwards. Due to the criticism that research had a bias to perceive nature-man relationship in a dichotomy between the two, research expanded its scope to also cover relationship between racial and environmental issues and interaction between human and nature. In 2000, in Japan, analysis against Japanese literature that adopts Western critical eco-criticism became quite active. In the recent years, interdisciplinary research exchange that tackles eco-criticism in research that covers not only Japan but East Asia as a whole is being conducted as well. So, against such trend, a concept of secondary nature presented by Shirane Haruo is quite important. Shirane had divided concept of nature in Japan into two. One is primary nature, which is an untouched nature, and another is secondary nature, an extension of man-made nature and human world. Furthermore, a secondary nature can be divided into two. One is what was developed by nobles men in capital, and second is so-called sceneries of Satoyama, which started to appear in the regional private estates starting from middle to end of the Heian era. The first type, according to Shirane, has a view of nature sophisticated by waka and linked verses is reflected. Secondary nature systemized through waka can be found in clothing, arts, and furnishing goods that existed in life space back then. For example, Tatsugawa River, which is a scenic place which became subject of wakas, is often associated with autumn color and fall, whereas another scenic place, Yoshino, is often associated with sakura and spring. Each motif is closely linked to a specific association with season. Such can be understood as an expression of secondary nature created as a basis of waka culture within society of noblemen instead of reflection of the actual nature. Expression of the nature that can be found in pictures, clothing, and furnishing goods do not represent the nature, but is created by the human society according to Shirane, and is quite important for my specialty, history of Middle Age arts. In the context of the eco-criticism, many pictures on waka, such as monthly pictures and seasonal pictures, were discussed. On the other hand, expression of secondary nature can also be found on religious pictures from Middle Age. Let's take a look at Kasuga-no-miya mandala, influenced by worshipping of Kasuga by Fujiwara clan as an example. In a way that views Kasuga shrines area, various Buddhas that depicts Mount Mikasa-yama, Kasuga, and Wakakusa are depicted. Main approach and mounds of earth are colored in gold, showing that the land is indeed holy. One of the characteristics of the Kasuga-miya mandala is that the majority of picture is composed of natural sceneries, and same trend can be observed in many pilgrimage mandala pictures created back in the second half of the Middle Age. Idealized a holy area and a view on nature are connected, and just like in case of pictures on waka, they express secondary nature created within the realm of the nobleman culture. Other than holy scenery, religious pictures from Middle Age often depicts hell and pure land, which are from afterlife. Picture of the hell, a picture of the coming of Amida Buddha to welcome the spirit of the dead, depicts the world that belongs outside of what the humans can perceive. If we are to utilize secondary nature theory of Shirane, it can be referred to as the pictures based on secondary five senses, meaning hell and pure land are not completely separated from our world, but can be understood as things that existed as an extension of life space back then, expanding our five senses to express in the medium of art. Such method is similar to augmented reality that overlays virtual reality against reality. In arts from Middle Age, perhaps we can observe man's universal activities that can also be found in the modern society and culture as well. With that, I would like to conclude my talk. Thank you.
Osawa-san,
thank you very much. Now starting from here, we only have 5 minutes or so left, but we would like to move on to discussion or say Q&A.
ここで話されたことを今ふと思ったんですけれども、先ほどのキーノートスピーチで
In the keynote speech, Professor Awa proposed the imaginary fiction is something that we can make a connection with. I prepared 3 prepared topics for discussion to visualize invisible things or hear unheard things and imagine about unhearing. So it's not the fiction, but in a real sense to reproduce so that culture and art power can be expressed. Then the invisible human fate can be visualized through
ことに気づかせる音の力。KASAI 先生や藤田先生のお話につながっていくように思いました。
astrology. So this is a link with the Professor KASAI's presentation, and art and culture may not necessarily be created from peaceful situations in a war of conflict and or under the disaster or the suffering under diseases. In such a time, there may be the source for creating art and culture. The professor in the Bloomfield just mentioned a number of topics within the society. People are pushed at the corner, or people being excluded. So there used to be a time of a particular group being excluded from the society. So a quite vivid culture was mentioned from him. In the life and our life, in the physical life, and living a life are tangible and limited. And how to make a connection of those lives and cultural property, it could be one of them. So by whom, what sort of connection will be created. So now having a perspective on that, this will be helpful in protecting the cultural property, or sometimes causing the destruction of the cultural properties. I think the last Alison-san's presentation provided insight for that, and inclusive of the word of the God and Buddha. In medieval era, people are not just living in the world of the people, but we also perceive the world and within to expand our domains, to see the life inclusive of God and beyond our lifetime. In order for us to consider that, we have been unable to give many the perspectives and many hints for the further thoughts. The time is limited, but if anyone can respond to that question from any of the panelists, I would be happy to take.
Yamamoto, thank you very much. If I may, I would like to speak a bit. Well, as you exactly said, well, in order to, of course, it is easy to try to ask people to imagine what others perceive, but I think we need a specific platform for people to be able to do that. Specifically, before the roundtable, I joined a program called Dialogue in Silence. The people with the hearing difficulty was there as a guidance, and we were asked to put on the headphones so that the sound would be cut. And we were told to use facial expression, writing, and so on in order to communicate. We could join in this program in order to communicate to each other, just like a game. It started out in Germany in about 20 years. Dialogue Diversity Museum. This event had been held. And at the time of the communication, we could feel and understand that we were dependent on the sounds and that we didn't really utilize the body language. When the people with the hearing difficulty and the people who can hear have the communication, of course, it would be convenient if the people could hear. It's not that everyone would be able to use sign language, and there is no need for us to feel hesitant to have a communication with the people with the hearing difficulty. Creativity, I think, should be utilized in order to communicate, and arts and project that enables us to do that is increasing right now. So such a device that would enable us to simulate all that would have to be considered to be important. We as a researcher would have to be committed to focus on to that. Thank you very much indeed. Well, that is something which I would love to expand on, and I would love to have other people online and people here to keep on communicating, but I must note that the time has come to an end. If those of you who are here who would like to give a word or two to the panelists, it's appreciated if you could do that personally after the session is over. Those of you who are online, I am sure that you have many opinions that you would like to share, but since the Roundtable 3's time is over, I would like to close the session. Well, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Thank you.